There is a kind of courage that is loud, the courage of soldiers on battlefields, of activists in public squares, of people who confront power with numbers and noise and the force of organized opposition. And then there is a different kind of courage, quieter and in some ways more terrifying, the courage of a person who acts alone, or nearly alone, in a place where the machinery of state violence is everywhere and omnipresent and watching, and who acts anyway, not because the odds are good, but because the alternative, silence, complicity, the long surrender of the self to a lie, is worse than the risk. Sophie Scholl was 21 years old. She was a student at the University of Munich. She carried a suitcase full of leaflets into a university building on the morning of February 18, 1943, climbed to the top floor and slid stacks of paper outside the lecture hall doors. On her way back down, she pushed a stack off a balcony railing and watched it flutter down into the atrium below. A custodian saw her. He reported her to the authorities. Within hours, she and her brother Hans were in Gestapo custody. She had known this was coming. She had known it for months. The only question had been when. Sophie Scholl was born in Forchenberg, a small town in southern Germany, the fourth of 5 children, in a family headed by Robert Scholl, the town's mayor. Her father was a man of strong principles and independent mind, and he had raised his children to think for themselves in a country that was rapidly organizing itself around the demand that no one think for themselves at all. Robert Scholl would later be arrested and imprisoned for making critical remarks about Hitler. His daughter would go further. Like many young Germans of her generation, Sophie had initially been caught up in the excitement of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, the Nazi youth organizations that had made membership effectively compulsory and had channeled the idealism of an entire generation into the service of the regime. But she had moved away from this early enthusiasm faster than most. Her faith, she was a devout Christian, deeply serious about questions of conscience and moral obligation, and her father's influence and her own independent thinking had led her, by her late teens, to a position of quiet but firm opposition. The White Rose began with her brother Hans and a small group of his friends at the University of Munich. Hans Scholl, Fritz Hartnagel, Alexander Schmerel, Christoph Probst, and Willy Graf, all of them young men who had served on the Eastern Front and come back changed by what they had seen, convinced that the war was criminal and that the regime prosecuting it was evil. They began writing and distributing leaflets in the summer of 1942, using a typewriter and a duplicating machine, printing in small batches and mailing them anonymously to professors, doctors, pub owners, people they hoped might carry the message further. Sophie knew what they were doing. She insisted on joining. This insistence itself was an act of courage. Hans initially resisted. The danger was extreme, and he understood it more concretely than she did, having served at the front and having a soldier's knowledge of what the state was willing to do. But Sophie was immovable. Staying silent, she argued, was itself a moral choice, a choice she was not willing to make. She joined the group and became, in the months that followed, one of its most active and essential members. She carried materials, organized logistics, contributed to the writing of the leaflets, and helped with the distribution runs that took the group to other German cities. The leaflets themselves were remarkable documents, written in a language that combined political analysis with moral philosophy and Christian theology. They addressed themselves to the conscience of ordinary Germans, people who knew, or could know if they allowed themselves to, what was being done in their name. They named the murders of the Jews directly, at a time when most Germans were either genuinely ignorant or maintaining a careful ignorance they had chosen. They called for resistance. They asked the question that the entire apparatus of Nazi propaganda was designed to prevent people from asking, "What kind of person are you going to be?" By the time Sophie and Hans were arrested in February of 1943, the group had produced and distributed 6 leaflets. The 6th had been the most ambitious, printed in tens of thousands of copies and distributed across Germany, including in cities where the group had established contacts. The title of the 6th leaflet was a quote from a speech by the German military commander who had just surrendered at Stalingrad. "Fellow students, the German people look to us." It was the last thing the White Rose produced. The Gestapo moved quickly. Sophie and Hans were arrested on February 18th. Christoph Probst was arrested the same day. The interrogations were conducted over 4 days with the efficiency of a system that had refined the extraction of confessions into a science. Sophie was interrogated repeatedly, and the record of those interrogations, preserved in Gestapo files that survived the war, shows a young woman who was clear-eyed, composed, and unwilling to lie about what she believed or why she had done what she had done. She admitted her role. She argued her position. She told her interrogators that what she had done was right and that she did not regret it. On February 22nd, 4 days after their arrest, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl, and Christoph Probst were tried before the People's Court of the Third Reich, presided over by Roland Freisler, the most feared judge in Nazi Germany. Freisler was not a judge in any meaningful sense. He was a performance of judicial authority in service of predetermined verdicts, and his courtroom was a theater of intimidation and contempt. He shouted, he mocked, he refused to allow meaningful defense. The trial lasted a few hours. The verdict was death. The execution was scheduled for the same day. Sophie Scholl walked to the guillotine in the afternoon of February 22, 1943. She had been given a cigarette beforehand, which she shared with her cellmates. She had been allowed a brief visit with her parents that morning, and the accounts of that meeting describe a young woman who was frightened. She was human, and she was 21 years old, and she knew what was coming, but who was also, by her parents' account, at peace with what she had done. Her father wept. Her mother held her. Sophie told them she had no regrets. A prison guard who witnessed her execution later reported that she walked to the scaffold calmly, without breaking down, and that her final words, spoken clearly in the hearing of several witnesses, were, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" She was executed at 5 in the afternoon. Hans was executed shortly after. Christoph Probst followed. They were 21, 24, and 23 years old. The regime that killed them survived for another 2 years and 2 months. It ended in rubble, in the ruins of the cities it had promised to make great, surrounded by the armies of the nations it had attacked, stripped of every claim to authority or legitimacy it had ever possessed. Sophie Scholl's name survived longer. In West Germany, in the years after the war, as a generation tried to understand what had happened and what it meant, and who had done what, and who had known what, and what could possibly be said in defense of a society that had produced Auschwitz, the story of the White Rose became something to hold on to. Here, at least, were young Germans who had seen clearly, who had not stayed silent, who had done what conscience required even when conscience was a death sentence. They were not sufficient evidence of anything about Germany as a whole. A few students with a duplicating machine cannot redeem a nation, but they were evidence that the choice had existed, that some people had made it, and that the refusal to accept the lie was possible even in the heart of the lie. Today, Sophie Scholl's face appears on postage stamps. Streets and schools across Germany bear her name. Surveys of German citizens have repeatedly placed her among the most admired Germans in history. The leaflets of the White Rose are reprinted and studied and taught. Her interrogation records are in archives that researchers from around the world have examined. Her story has been made into films, plays, operas, novels. She was 21 years old, and she had a suitcase full of leaflets, and she knew exactly what she was doing and exactly what it would cost her. What does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened? She asked the question as if she already knew the answer. She was right.